Today, we're going to finish up with part two of our lecture on the Mary Tyler Moore Show as our vehicle to talk about some of the women's issues of the 1970s, where we're looking at from 1970 to 1980, pretty much. And we got a lot to cover, but I wanted to make a couple of quick comments as we get started here, because obviously we started with TV in the early 70s and the images of women, on television and the ads and some of the barriers that women were facing at that time. And then we talked about the show Mary Tyler Moore and how, on one hand, it seemed like a traditional show, but then it really had some, at the time, somewhat radical elements to it. And it was very much commenting very subtly at times on some of the issues facing working women in particular. And I showed you several clips, and I'm going to show at least one more during this part two. But I wanted to talk about a couple of quick things before I switched over to the PowerPoint. Again, the early 70s was a time of a lot of changes. I've been talking, and I will continue to talk about some of the barriers that women were facing. But there were a lot of positive changes at this point that I think need to be mentioned. I mean, there were a lot of women entering the workplace for the first time. Just to give you some figures, I mean, from 1970 to 1980, we see the number of female lawyers go from 4% of lawyers to over 15%, of pharmacists from 13% to 26%, doctors from less than 9% to almost 15%. We see in 1970 the first Lutheran female pastor, 1972 the first female Jewish rabbi, 1974 the first female Episcopal priest, 1974 we also see the first commercial pilot for a major airline who's a woman. Chicago in 1979 elects its first female mayor, Jane Byrne. Arizona State Senator Sandra Day O'Connor is elected in 1973. And in 1983, she's going to be the first female Supreme Court justice. We see our first female Rhodes Scholar, the first Harvard Law Review editor in 1976, the first female referee for a prize boxing fight for a Muhammad Ali fight in 1976. Jimmy Carter in the late 70s will name the first woman to a cabinet level position in his administration. So we are seeing a lot of changes during this decade, but there's still a lot of barriers. And there's beginning to be a lot of debate, and it's not just between men and women, but between women themselves. One thing that's always been there when we talk about women's rights, or even they use the term feminism, because that term itself, and I've kind of avoided the term a little bit because it does seem to have some political baggage to it. In fact, a lot of women, including Mary Tyler Moore, were very clear: I'm not a feminist. I'm for women's rights, but I don't consider myself a feminist. And one thing that we can see it in the 19th century, and we'll see it also later in the 80s and 90s. But it emerges yet again in the mid 70s, and that is sort of this split in the women's movement. In the early 70s, it's a lot more of women kind of on the same side, making the same arguments, whether they identify as feminists or not. But by the mid 70s, we will see a larger split. As one historian, I think it's Christina Hoff Sommers, she gave it two terms: maternal feminism versus radical feminism. Maternal feminism might be considered a little more traditional, maybe a little more conservative, arguing for equality of women's opportunities, but really arguing that women are unique from men in many ways, and that they are not exactly the same as men, and emphasizing maybe the more maternal role that women could play in society. While the other side is a little more on the left. Again, this particular person called it more radical, which argues for not just equality of opportunity, but just equality altogether, and that we really shouldn't really think of men and women as truly different. And this split will get wider and wider as we get into, say, the 80s, debates over, of course, abortion, which we are going to talk about today, but it debates over things like pornography, sex work, and of course, as we're getting closer to the 21st century, debates over things such as gender, which has kind of blurred the lines even more over these debates. One more thing, so a lot of the debates we're having in the 21st century aren't completely new. We are seeing some of these debates and splits happening in the 70s. One more thing I wanted to mention is a lot of times people do talk about today in 2022, for instance, a lot of arguments over language, and we're changing our language. But this is a normal thing. Every generation changes language. English in particular is a very flexible language. It's a very malleable language, which is not the case with all languages. Um, and it is normal for that to happen. It can be frustrating sometimes for people my age to say, "What word do we use now?" But in reality, it could be a very healthy thing. And we see a lot of this happening in the early 70s. Trying to get away from saying man and wife to saying things like partner and spouses. Instead of saying a chairman, you just say, well, who's going to chair the meeting? Getting away from gender specific words. And again, that's not a new thing. I hear people say this all the time, but that's, we see real efforts to make these changes in the early 70s, because it used to be men that were the mailman and the fireman and the policeman. I can remember as a kid, people still saying like, all right, there's a female policeman, instead of saying police officer. But the reality was, we are seeing women enter the workplace in huge numbers in the 70s, and the language needed to change to be just simply accurate. Anyway, I just wanted to talk a little bit of make a couple of quick comments in general. Let me switch to the PowerPoint and make sure I'm sharing sound before we move on. Okay, so let's get back to where we left off the other day. So we were talking about credit cards, and I did a brief history of credit cards, and the fact that up until the early 70s, specifically 74, women didn't have the same access to credit cards. If you were single, a very good chance you were not allowed to get a credit card or to get a bank loan in many cases. And that was outlawed in 1974 with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Another problem that many women faced in the 70s and before was the fact that if they decided to reproduce, if they got pregnant, many jobs could put them on permanent maternity leave. Either they could fire them or simply not hire them. A typical question was, do you plan to have kids? Yes. Okay, I'm not going to hire you now. This was a real problem because, again, it takes two to reproduce, but only one's getting fired for it. In fact, in many cases, men were getting higher pay than women because of the fact that they were fathers. But mothers were not only not getting higher pay, but often were losing their jobs for it, because obviously that's not equal. And this specific type of discrimination was outlawed in 1978 officially by a bill that Jimmy Carter signed at that point, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, which outlawed firing or not hiring somebody specifically because they are pregnant. So again, the Mary Tyler Moore Show is coinciding with a lot of these efforts in what is called the second wave of feminism. And the big one, we talked about Title VII the other day, which technically was in the 60s, although a lot of the movement of Title VII didn't really happen until the 70s. The other big one is Title IX. And this is a separate law from Title VII, even though it sounds very similar. So let me tell you a little bit how Title IX came about. So when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 came along, and it did include sex as one of the categories for which you could not discriminate against, which is Title VII, there was an exception made, and that was for education. So in the education world, there was still quite a bit of discrimination. Bernice Sandler was in grad school at the University of Maryland, and she was getting her PhD in education. She was a very well-respected grad student, was a great teacher, good researcher, but was told by a lot of people, including people hiring in higher ed, said, we're not going to hire you. You're too strong of a woman, too powerful of a personality. And she started to look into this. And in fact, her husband said, this is sex discrimination. And she began to look into this issue of higher ed and their hiring practices. And she saw that, only about 25% of women getting their PhDs were ever hired for higher ed. In fact, a lot of places had it in writing that they would give PhDs to women, but would actually not hire women in those faculty positions. In fact, there were still schools as late as the early 70s that were still all male. I mean, this was still something that was happening. And even in the public school system, she began to, because she started researching this, and she realized that there was vast discrimination in schools, including what they offered. For instance, the New York public schools would offer home ec for women. And some of you, I don't know if that's still offered in schools today, but that was a course that taught you how to cook and how to clean house, home economics. But a lot of it focused around cooking, but they also offer culinary, which is teaching you how to be a professional chef. That was only for the boys. The girls could take home ec, but only the boys could take the professional version of that class, if you will. A lot of schools were still not completely offering sports programs for women. Or if they did, the boys teams would get, the Friday night games. They would get to practice in the best facilities and when they needed to practice. And then the girls teams, if they had them, would have to take whatever was left. So she began to see a lot of these disparities, not only in the public school system, but more shockingly in the higher ed system. And she, began to research. She eventually began to file suit against 250 different colleges based on these discriminatory practices. At the same time, U.S. Representative Edith Green, a Democrat from Oregon, who had been in Congress since 1954, so she had quite a bit of seniority by 1970. She began to hold hearings about these practices. She was aware of this research. And she began to, again, hold hearings. And in fact, Holly Knox was the legislative aide that really did a lot of this research and then would gather a lot of the testimony about some of these hiring practices and some of these conditions. And in fact, met with White House staff, which she always pointed out she was the only female in the room when she would do this. We're talking the Nixon administration. And they would agree. They said, look, we agree that there's some unfair practices here. We really need to do something about this. But we're not going to actually support any kind of bill. You're talking about football. You're talking about baseball. You're talking, we're not going to politically risk our political stakes on a bill that's going to prove to be quite controversial. Because if you start talking about equality in higher ed, you're talking about equality in things like sports and football, and that's not going to go down well. So it's very frustrating because, again, here's the administration admitting that there's a problem and yet wouldn't do much to do it. And another group that got involved, the Women's Equality Action League, WEAL, which Sandler was working with, they're starting to push this as well. Eventually, Edith Green on the House, at the same time in the Senate side, Senate Birch Bayh, they both kind of start creating parallel bills, which is very common. And then eventually they get combined into one bill. There was an education bill that was making its way through Congress. It was one of these massive education funding bills, has a bunch of stuff in it. And they both, in both houses of Congress, they both sort of snuck in a small amendment. They didn't make a big deal about it. They proposed it at the last moment. I want to add an amendment to this bill, And again, they told Bernie Sandler, WEAL, other women's groups, don't lobby, don't make a big deal about it, don't talk about it, just let us get this through. And it worked. The amendment did indeed get added to the bill. The bill got passed. Nixon signed it. And again, we're talking about these giant bills where people weren't even paying attention to what was in the bill. And of course, that little amendment became known as Title IX, just one of the sections of the bill. And of course, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And of course, being Congress, they can't tell a state what to do or a county what to do with its education systems or its state university systems. But if federal funding is involved, then you can't. That's how these things tend to work. And so again, every school system is receiving federal aid. Every university system, private and public, are receiving federal aid. So this is going to affect everybody. Just like with Title VII, though, not much was done. Because again, you can pass a bill, that's great, but you got to have regulations. You got to have an administrative code. You got to tell people how would this work? How do you actually implement this? And this was in a department, HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare, which no longer exists as that. It's changed now, but the HEW was the one that was facilitating this. They pretty much just said, we're not going to do anything about this for 3 years. It took a court case before they finally began to move on this. So Title IX is going to remain an issue throughout the 70s because women are going to constantly say, you're not doing enough. It's supposed to be no discrimination. Where's the female football team? Where's the female baseball team? By the way, speaking of sports, since this is something that a big part of this was sports, it did not say that all sports had to be equally funded. Because there was a political reality. Actually, let me back up here. There was a political reality that, football, for instance, was always going to be a bigger sport than, say, softball. So the bill was specific. It didn't say they had to have equal funding, but they had to have equal opportunity. So, but it was controversial enough. Now, today, when people talk about Title IX, we tend to talk about it more along the lines of things like sexual harassment, an issue we will deal with later in this class, issues of sexual assault. And lately, it's even become more focused on discrimination based on, say, sexual orientation. Although, I'm speaking in 2022, because there is a lot of debate about transgender issues and about issues of homosexuality on campus, some colleges are not including those kinds of issues on their websites when they talk about Title IX. It is starting, some schools for political reasons are backing off some of this. So Title IX got very big, but some schools are retracting it. Since we're at ABAC, I did want to mention there is a Title IX page. There is a very strong statement about this anti-discrimination at ABAC, and there is a Title IX page specifically on ABAC, as there are almost every college website. And there are procedures for filing Title IX grievances and such. So just like all other colleges, ABAC is very much dedicated, of course, to Title IX. And they do have resources for the LGBTQ plus community. So, but we are seeing a lot of schools, even in 2022, beginning to back off some of this. So it'll be interesting to see where Title IX and how Title IX is used in the next decade. Because again, in other words, Title IX is not just something that happened in the 70s. It is something very much alive and debated over quite a bit today. Excuse me. And just not to get too much into politics, but again, this was a bill written in the early 70s. And so, again, not surprisingly, it uses terms like male, female, boy, girl. Even though there were trans Americans at that point, that was not something people talked much about. And so some people have said, well, if you go back to the amendment, it doesn't say anything about trans. It only says boy and girl. It's two genders. So we're not going to talk about transgender. So again, it is interesting how these things have stayed alive. And again, there was a lot of debate over whether women should be part of sports. Is it going to ruin sports if women have to be included in it? And again, we are seeing these kind of debates sort of being mirrored today with debates over trans athletes, which I will admit is a complicated issue. But and I'm not taking a side here, but it is interesting. We are seeing some of this, and Title IX is one of the things being used to argue for and against trans in sports. So again, these issues are still very relevant. A big event in sort of the issue of women's rights in the 70s, it's again kind of faded, I think, from memory lately, was an event that was simply referred to as the Battle of the Sexes. This was in 1973. And to some degree, this came from the debates over Title IX. So I always think of the 70s as the decade of tennis. I mean, it's been around for a long time. It goes back to, medieval England. Henry VIII played tennis, Mary Queen of Scots played tennis. But the 70s really was kind of the decade for tennis. I mean, it became a huge fad in the 70s. In fact, we'll talk later about the rise of healthcare, jogging, aerobics, all of this became self-help books, all became big in the 70s, and tennis was part of this. So pro tennis was very popular in the 70s. Bobby Riggs, he was 55 years old in 1973. He had won, he was a major pro tennis player when he was younger. He won Wimbledon several times, and he was still quite decent player at this point. And he began to rail against women in sports. And he said, no woman can ever beat a man. I'm 55 years old and I can still beat any woman at tennis. And he challenged women to play him in tennis. And in 1973, the first battle of the sexes match happened between him and a very good tennis player named Margaret Court, and Bobby Riggs won. Then he challenged the best female player at that time, Billie Jean King, to play him in tennis. And let me play you a little bit of, oh, by the way, this is Charlie Brown with the Peanuts cartoon talking a little bit about, if you want to pause it to read it real quick, but this is a little bit of them referring to Bobby Riggs beating Margaret Court. So he had been challenging Billie Jean King. She had denied him initially. And then after the Margaret Court, she thought, well, I can't, I have to play him now. I can't let this guy get away with this. So let me play a little clip of Bobby Riggs talking. And this is just a really short clip on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. And I'm kind of curious I wish we could talk right in a second. I'd be curious what your reaction is, but I'm going to tell you my reaction once we're done.
You lost me there somewhere, yeah.
Yeah, she's carrying a banner for the women. Billie Jean King.
Do you like women? So a lot of people said you don't like women. This is really more than just...
I like them real good in the bedroom, the kitchen, and when they bring you the slippers and the pipe. And, I really think...
You're a male chauvinist, eh?
I really think the best way to handle the women is to keep them pregnant and barefoot. This way, they don't worry about getting out in the men's world and competing for jobs and trying to get equal money and all that baloney. And they stay in their place and they help their men and they're behind the throne, because I really believe, John.
You want them out plowing the fields, don't you, and just having kids.
The male is king, the male is supreme, and the women should know that.
Now, I mean, he's like ticking every sexist box, right? To some degree, I think he believed a little bit of that. But the reality was he sounds like a pro wrestler there. I mean, the audience is reacting and people were really mad at him. I mean, this was a real thing. But it does seem in reality that he kind of knew that this was a show. It was a way to get relevant again. He got a lot of ads out of this. He made a lot of appearances on TV shows. And apparently behind the scenes, he's the one that kind of planned all this. And it was almost like a pro wrestling thing. And of course, they do play, and she does beat him. And again, even she admits later that, yeah, he wasn't really that bad. This was almost good PR for Title IX. And in fact, it actually kind of had a good effect in the end. And the fact that they did several appearances. This is them on a TV show called The Odd Couple, based on the Neil Simon play, which was produced by Mary Tyler Moore Productions. You might know it kind of looks the same. I'll just play a short clip from it. So this is Bobby Riggs, and you'll see Billie Jean King.
Let's play again. I'm hot.
Can't. Somebody else has got the room booked.
Oh. Who is it? I'm hot tonight. I'll play anybody. Uh-oh. Forget it. Hi, Billie Jean. Long time no see.
Who'd you hustle today? Well, at least you're smarter now. You're only playing men.
How about a game of ping pong?
How much?
50 cents?
Big spender.
Anyway, so that was kind of, for a long time, that was kind of the symbol of the battle over the women's movement. But again, today, looking back, it does feel very planned and innocent in many ways. One last little bit here before we get into more serious stuff. This is speaking of colleges and higher ed, this is coming out a little bit of my own research down in Florida. Another big issue dealing with women's rights in higher ed was dorm visitation and dorm living arrangements. And again, we're talking late 60s, early 70s, the sexual revolution. We now have the pill. We have more birth control. A lot of these, unmarried women who are able to get the pill now. But yet, at many of our higher education facilities, including the one I went to, Florida State University, which is where my mother-in-law also went. And there's a reason I'm saying that. They had very different rules. So first off, dorms were very separated between male dorms and female dorms. But as my mother-in-law likes to talk about, she was at FSU up till 1967. And as she always explains, if you were a male student at Florida State University, which used to be ironically an all-women's college until 1948, the Florida State College for Women, but now it was co-ed. But the male students could stay out all night if they wanted. Nobody cared. You know, if they lived in a dorm, they go out, stay out all night, come in whenever they want. But for the female dorms, and again, it was originally a women's college to begin with, they had, and I believe it was a 10 o'clock curfew. If you're going to be later, you had to get permission. You had to sign out of your dorms. You had to sign into your dorms. The doors were locked at 10 o'clock. So if you were late, you had to get permission to get back in. I mean, that's clearly not equal. And you were not allowed to have men come to your room, and this was a big thing. I mean, these colleges are co-ed, and that's FSU, but that was very common. And a lot of colleges were beginning to say, well, maybe we should allow men to come to women's rooms and women go to men's rooms. I mean, it is co-ed. People do study together and they do projects together. It's not all about romance and sex, but even if it is, I mean, they are grown-ups, So a lot of colleges like FSU began to allow visitation. One of the ways they did it was they would have some dorms that would be all female or all male, and they would say, no visitation rights here. But then other dorms, they would say, well, we will allow male female visitation in these dorms. So they still tried to, because some students weren't comfortable with this. Anyway, Florida, like many states, began to experiment with this. And at first they went through it, but most people were happy. Even parents were okay with this. This is the 70s. And in Florida, again, I'm using Florida as my example. The person you see here was, a rising politician in Florida, and she later became a judge in Florida, still actually a federal judge. She hasn't, as of 2022, she's still a federal judge. I think she's emeritus now, but she spoke out very forcefully about this. And again, this is getting a little bit into this kind of women's movement split, because she definitely was a woman that believed in equal opportunity. Again, she was a lawyer. She became a legislator. She later became a judge. But she believed that, this is promoting the wrong behavior. And in her speech, she very infamously referred to schools like University of Florida and Florida State University, state-funded whorehouses. And of course, that's implying that the female students are literally whores. This caused a huge outcry in Florida. There were marches against her, and marches, at the universities. And we do begin to see these same types of things happening across the country. I just happen to know a little bit about this particular one. Initially, a lot of schools clamped down on visitation rights and co-ed dorms. But by the mid-70s, they went back to allowing this, which is pretty much where we are today. This is a particular article that I purposely copied the whole thing. This is from the State Archives. It's an article, a student newspaper, talking about the whole visitation rights issue. And here they're talking about ending the visitation rights, at least briefly. This is 1971. But it's interesting, the article also on the front page about a lot of the students referred to as co-eds, because this is University of South Florida, which used to be an all-male school, and now they have females, so the females were referred to as the co-ed. So co-ed always referred to female, it didn't refer to the men. Talking about co-eds going to New York to get abortions, which was just starting to be another political issue, the whole issue of abortion. So it is interesting, two of these issues are on the front page of the same newspaper. So again, Mary Tyler Moore show was part of this kind of cultural zeitgeist of the women's movement and women bonding to overcome various barriers. And again, Mary Tyler Moore sort of representing a woman, single working woman overcoming these barriers herself. For instance, pay continues to be an issue today, and debated all the time. Do we still see pay disparities and such? And this was a huge issue in the 70s still. And this is Mary Tyler Moore dealing with this with her boss, Ed Grant, played, of course, by the actor Ed Asner.
figured it was just one of those woman things.
No, Mr. Grant, it's not one of those woman things. I would like to know why the last associate producer before me made $50 a week more than I do.
Oh, because he was a man.
Let me get this straight. The only reason he was paid more than I am is because he was a man?
Oh, sure. It has nothing to do with your work.
Wait, no. Wait a minute. You know, because I really want to understand this. I'm doing as good a job as he did.
Better.
And I'm being paid less than he was because...
You're a woman.
Well, Mr. Grant, there is no good reason why two people doing the same job at the same place shouldn't be making
He
the
had
same...
a family to support. You don't. Now, why don't you come back when you have an answer to that?
Because financial need has nothing to do with it. Because in order to be consistent with what you're saying, you would have to pay the man with 3 children more than the man with 2 children. And the married man more than the bachelor. And Mr. Grant, you don't do that. So what possible reason can you give me for not paying me at least as much as the man who had this job before me?
Say, Lou.
Yes, Ted.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know you were busy.
Oh, we're not. Come on in, Ted.
And of course, by the way, the joke is Ed Asner's character can't stand the character that just walked in, but now he's glad to have him in there. To me, what strikes me about this, I mean, that was the argument for the disparity in pay. It's interesting if that was on a TV show today, how, the second he said, well, because he was a man, I mean, immediately the audience would have booed and the discussion would have been over. This is still when this was still considered a real argument, and the fact that the audience didn't really respond to that, because this was filmed in front of a live audience, is kind of interesting. So again, Mary Tyler Moore Show was a huge hit. And this, again, not to overplay too much of a TV show, but this really did play a role in how women began to, especially younger women, saw themselves. They modeled themselves often after Mary Tyler Moore. And the fact that this show could have a single woman who was, even if it was subtly, divorced, sexually active, taking the pill, arguing for women's rights, arguing for equal pay, it could be a big hit. And not just a big hit with one demographic, but a top 10 hit, began to inspire other types of shows. Without Mary Tyler Moore, for instance, there wouldn't have been the show All in the Family, a very different style of show. But Mary Tyler Moore kind of paves the way for a show like All in the Family. But it also changes just the roles of women on television and the other types of comedies that can come out at this point. CBS, which aired both Mary Tyler Moore and All in the Family, was a network that was known for showing a lot of very Southern shows and rural shows like Hee Haw, which, was a country music show that was supposed to be kind of the country music version of the show Laugh-In. Gomer Pyle, Green Acres, Sorry, Petticoat Junction. I couldn't remember the name of that one. Sorry. Beverly Hillbillies, Mayberry RFD. These were all shows that were still airing on CBS, and they were all very popular. But CBS wanted to kind of go down the Mary Tyler Moore, like, hey, this is urban, this is modern, this is working. Even though these shows made money, these shows are very much 60s. We want shows that are now 70s. So very controversially, they canceled all of these shows. As one person said it, they canceled every show with a tree in it, which is the name of the study of this. That is known as the Rural Purge. And actually was initially very unpopular with a lot of viewers because they're like, what happened to my show? But it paid off for CBS because it opened the way for very different types of shows, and shows that are still referenced a lot today, like All in the Family. Shows that dealt with social issues, political issues that were much more ethnically and racially diverse. And again, really kind of the quintessential kind of TV show of the 70s were these post Mary Tyler Moore, post Rural Purge TV shows. And CBS was really trying, instead of being the old person's safe conservative network. They were trying to be, as you can see, the Now Network. Shows like Barney Miller, Sanford and Son, the Jeffersons, What's Happening, Good Times, the Bob Newhart Show. All of these were urban, they were hip, they were in many cases very political, very socially aware, and extremely popular. And much more popular than had been the earlier rural shows had been. Oh, and MASH, which technically is about the Korean War, but it's really about the Vietnam War. And Chico and the Man, another one's with a very new comedian from Puerto Rico named Freddie Prinze. Some of you might know Freddie Prinze Jr. This was his father. First show to really have a Latin American lead character. Sadly, he didn't handle success very well. It's very popular stand-up comedian that got his own show, but did have some drug problems, some mental issues, and sadly committed suicide soon after the show became a big hit. But again, we're seeing a lot of firsts. It shows with real diversity, shows like Welcome Back, Kotter, which is based on Gabe Kaplan. That's the guy on the right, a stand-up comedian, based on his real life growing up in New York, where he actually belonged to a group of friends that were racially and ethnically diverse. But that kind of sort of experience what had not been on TV before until shows like this. Again, these shows seem very innocent today and very simplistic compared to what we can do today. But at the time, these were really quite, radical shows. I don't remember where I got this term. I'm sure I got it from somebody else, but I always thought of these shows as the beige shows because they do all kind of have the same look. Everything's very brown and very earth tone. Some of that's just a style. I mean, that's the kind of clothes people wore. That was just the colors of the time. But I think it's also the lighting. But there is something very. They're not flashy shows. They're not colorful shows. They're very beige. They're trying to look more realistic. All the apartments and houses look kind of dingy. So I refer to it as the beige era. And again, I'm pretty sure I got that from somebody else. But again, these shows are great to watch for historians because they are kind of this. They do sort of capture the time, if you will, in ways I think TV shows and other times you have to dig a little more. Here, they're wearing the times on their sleeve. But in addition to dealing with diversity and ethnic issues and racial issues and political issues, I mean, also just dealing straight up with female issues. I mean, a lot of shows had single women. I mean, after Mary Tyler Moore, they didn't hide the fact that they were divorced anymore. Women dealing with issues of post-marriage or dealing with work issues. I mean, in other words, following that Mary Tyler Moore model, this became a very typical type of show. Alice, I think, would maybe be the quintessential version of this. Alice I think it's a show that's not very well known today, but it was a huge hit in the 1970s, based on a Martin Scorsese movie called Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. Again, about a woman with a kid who just gets divorced and moves to, I believe it's New Mexico, and gets a job as a waitress. Here's the opening credits.
Early to rise, early to bed. And in between I cooked and cleaned and went out of my head. Going through life with blinders on, it's tough to see. I had to get out from under and look for me. There's a new girl in town and she's looking good. There's a fresh, freckled face in the neighborhood. There's a new girl in town with a brand new style. She was just passing through, but if things work out, she's gonna stay a while.
Again, this is that, like with Mary Tyler Moore, this is the era where every show had kind of a kind of a pop song as their theme. And again, this one's clearly based on Mary Tyler Moore. She even has a boss that looks the same as Ed Asner, sexist boss, got kind of a wacky group of workers that that share the work. Oh, I want to play it again. And this is a silly little thing, but try to get you a little bit into the pop culture of the time. There was a catchphrase on the show that that they use quite a bit. Let me go ahead and play this.
You see, we have been cutting our pies into 6 pieces. But now we are going to cut our pies into 8 pieces.
Babe,
that's the big news that you have for us.
Yeah.
That's wonderful, Mel. For you, but not for us. We want more money.
You want more money? You got it. Same pie. Same price per piece. More servings, more tips.
You turnip.
What's with the bird brain? Oh, I also want to tell you, I'm thinking about watering down the chicken soup.
How? You already use chicken like a tea bag now.
Look at, I'm doing it for you.
Mel, would you like to do something for me?
Yeah, what?
Kiss my grits.
Yeah. You see,
So again, kind of the same scene, asking for more pay, but that line, "Kiss my grits," just that was a huge catchphrase in the 70s, and obviously it's just a little bit dirty. But again, that was another theme in the 70s, TV shows. The idea of a character having a catchphrase that they would say every show. This is one of the first shows, not the first, but one of the first to actually have that catchphrase, and that became very much a common thing in the 1970s TV shows. And again, we're seeing a lot of these shows come out. Some of them were not as popular. I mean, the Cindy Duncan had her own show. Shirley MacLaine had a show called Shirley's World. Neither one of these made it very far. But again, we're starting to see at least efforts to bring more and more women, in particular women, unmarried women. The shows about the woman, not the man. Probably the beyond Mary Tyler Moore, probably the one that's most famous and infamous would be the show Maude, starring the actress Bea Arthur. This was actually a character that came from All in the Family, and it was the sister of Edith Bunker, and then it got spun off into its own TV show. And then from this show, oops, I forgot I had a clip. Darn. And then from this show, she had a maid named Florida, and she became part of a show called Good Times. Also from All in the Family, we get the show Jefferson. So the All in the Family became like this little television universe, if you will. But again, Maude was one that, because it came from All in the Family, it pushed the boundaries a little bit further. So it was a little bit stronger in some of its social message and some of its topics than some of these other shows were. Here's a little bit of the intro.
Lady Godiva was a freedom rider. She didn't care if the whole world looked. Joan of Arc with the Lord to guide her. She was a sister who really cooked. Isadora was the first bra burner. Ain't you glad she showed up? Oh, yeah. And when the country was falling apart, Betsy Ross got it all sewed up. And then there's Maude. 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 That uncompromising, enterprising, anything but tranquilizer. Right on, Maude.
So as you can see from the scene, the opening song, I mean, they're not even hiding the fact that she's a feminist. I mean, they even heard the phrase, the original bra burner, So this show, again, dealt with a lot of issues that other shows shied away from, including issues such as gay rights, which is something that was just emerging as a big issue in the 70s, something we will deal with in more detail in another lecture. But I did want to play you a quick clip from Maude talking about this issue.
From Television City in Hollywood.
Oh, this is Good Times. I forgot. I did have to sing for Good Times. So let me go ahead and play this. I forgot I had this in there. This is the show that came out of Maude.
Temporary layoffs. Good times. Easy credit rip-offs. Good times. Scratching and surviving. Good times. Hanging in a jar. Good times. If we lucky, we got 'em. Good
Again, I kind of miss all these catchy songs that TV shows used to have. This was sorry, I kind of stepped on this, but this is one of the very first shows that have a black family on TV. In this case, it was a poor black family living in the projects. Later, you'll get shows like The Jeffersons, which is about a black family that actually makes money and moves to the Upper West Side, as they say in the song. So again, today this seems very quaint, but at the time, this was really quite shocking to see, again, people of color being portrayed as the lead characters of a TV show.
From television.
So let's talk a little bit about Maude. This is where I thought it was a second ago. So let me play the clip that deals with gay rights on Maude. This is just a super quick clip.
I hope you're satisfied, Maude Finley. A bunch of homosexual pansies has just opened a gay bar in Tuckahoe.
And what did Arthur say?
He said he'd think about it.
It's that new place in the shopping center. I thought it was a Mexican restaurant. I mean, they call it the Gay Caballeros. Somebody told me today they don't even serve food there. It's a bar, and all the caballeros are gay. Here, Vivian, I forgot to bring over my shaving kit. Would you run that upstairs for me, please?
Oh. Arthur, you're upsetting Maude. You remember what we talked about nothing controversial.
Look, Maude, I am upset about this gay bar in the neighborhood. And I'll admit I'm going to be talking about it a lot. It was very nice of you to ask us to stay here, but I think we better clear the air. Now, if my being here is going to cause any trouble at all, I want you to say so right now.
I think it's going to cause a lot of trouble.
All right, now that we've cleared the air, Vivian, you can take that shaving kit upstairs.
Again, the show deals more with the issue as it goes on, but just the fact that they're talking about this issue was quite radical in the 70s to even mention homosexuality. But actually, to be fair, Mary Tyler Moore actually did it first. And this is an episode of Mary Tyler Moore. She has one neighbor named Rhoda. We talked about her in class the other day. She's friends with the brother of another neighbor, another friend of Mary's named Phyllis, played by Cloris Leachman. And Phyllis and Rhoda do not get along. Phyllis is very upset that Rhoda's dating her brother and might marry her brother. And she's just completely upset over this. They're at a party. The fact that they get upset kind of ends the party. So they have a quick conversation. And here's the conversation.
When? Good night, Rhoda.
Phyllis, for heaven's sake. I can't believe you took me seriously. What do you mean? Phyllis, Ben and I aren't getting married. He's not my type.
What do you mean he's not your type? He is witty. He is attractive. He's successful. He's single. He's gay. He's what?
He's gay. I thought sure you knew, Phil. We're not getting married.
Oh, Rhoda, I'm so relieved.
And again, the fact that, there's a reveal that a character is gay and it's not a problem. It's not like shocking. What are we going to do about it? This is horrible. It's like, oh, okay. He's gay. I didn't know that. Of course, she's happy they're not getting married, but, so again, we're seeing TV directly addressing a lot of these issues that had not really been talked about on TV. But Maude went a lot further than most shows were going, and especially on the one hot button issue that would become a bigger issue as we get into the 80s, 90s, and into the 21st century. And of course, that is the issue of abortion, which is what we're about to get into. So on the show, now, I'm going to admit, so I always thought this was weird because I never thought like Maude could have a child. I always thought she was like in her 60s. The character is supposed to be 47 on the show. So older, but still within range of having a child. So Maude has gotten pregnant, her and her husband, because she is married on the show. So, and her husband is played by Bill Macy. You're going to see him in a moment. And so they don't know if they want, it's a 2-part episode. And they don't know if they want to have the child or not. He has agreed to get a vasectomy, which was also very common in the 70s, that the idea of men getting vasectomies. This is partly about, sexual freedom. Also, you know, if we're going to do birth control, men should be doing stuff too. But by the way, tying it in with my environmental history class, this is also very much, there's a lot of fears of overpopulation in the 70s. That was a big concern at the time. And so it was very common for men to get vasectomies so that they would contribute to more population. But, and of course, on the show, he doesn't do it. He chickens out at the last moment. You'll see that hinted. But she thinks he wants to have the child. He thinks she wants to have the child. And this is, they're in bed together at the end of the show and they're talking about it, and you'll see it play out.
Now that you've had your vasectomy, well, if anything happened to me... No, let me finish. Sweetheart, if anything happened to me and you wanted to get married again and you wanted to be a father again, but you couldn't. I mean, have you thought about that, Walt?
I never wanted to become a father before. Why should I want to become one later on?
I don't understand you, Walter.
I'm happy to become a father because you want to have a baby, not because I want to become a father. Jen.
Walter, what are you trying to do? You pick up 2 cards and you gin.
Now, wait a second, Maud. Were you having the baby because you thought I wanted it?
Well, you do, don't you?
Sweetheart, would it disappoint you too much to learn that becoming a father was never one of my life's ambitions? I don't know why. For years, I used to feel guilty about it. For years, people told me I was nuts or selfish. How can I not love kids? Well, I do love kids, but they don't have to be mine. That's probably the worst confession I'll ever make. Do you hate me?
Of course not, darling. I love you. I love you, and I love my life.
Jen.
I take it all back! What are you trying to do to me? I don't even have time to sort my cards, and you're ginning out on me.
Forget the cards, Maud. We have something much more important to talk about.
What, you finally decided you do want a pickle?
Maud, I want you to have whatever it is you want. Does that include the baby?
Well, it did when I thought you wanted it.
Well, Maud, I think it would be wrong to have a child at our age.
Oh, so do I, Walter. Oh, Walter, so do I.
We'd make awful parents.
Oh, impatient, irascible.
Awful. It's just not our time
well,
of life.
For other people, it might be fine, but for us, I don't think it would be fair to anybody. Oh, Walter, hold me closer.
Are you frightened, Maud? About the operation, I mean.
Don't be ridiculous, darling. Why should I be frightened? Were you frightened of the vasectomy?
So, again, this was controversial. I mean, there were articles about it. So there were complaints about it. But again, it is quite shocking that in the 70s, you know, considering the shows that came before, you got a character, a husband who doesn't want kids. You know, shows are all supposed to be about families. They're talking about vasectomies. They're talking about not wanting kids. And of course, it ends with them deciding to have an abortion. I mean, that's the ultimate decision. They're going to have the abortion. She's not going to keep the kid. You weren't seeing shows do this before. And to be honest, after this period in the early to mid 70s, you're really not going to see it again. You're not seeing many shows like The Cosby Show or Friends or Seinfeld talking about abortion. You know, this is in some ways, some of these shows to me, I think are almost more shocking now than they were maybe even at the time, because shows are so careful not to be overly political today sometimes. And that definitely would be the case by the 1980s. So this, again, there's kind of this little weird period where these shows were very open about their politics and such. So that show brought up abortion, which means we need to talk about the issue of abortion. And I'm very aware that this is still a hugely divisive issue, and it's a very complex issue and a very emotional issue for people. And of course, I'm recording this in September 2022, and this summer we had the Dobbs decision, which essentially overturned the Roe v. Wade decision. So abortion is very much as was Title IX, but even more so, it is something that is very much something we're talking about today. So let's talk a little bit about abortion in the 70s, and I am going to do a little short history of abortion law in America, because that you do need to understand that to understand Roe v. Wade. And this will be an issue that will continue to be discussed throughout the 80s and 90s, and again all the way up to the 21st century. And essentially started in the 70s, started with two women. The two women you see here, Ms. Kano and Ms. DeCorby, and we'll get into both of them in a moment. So we're really talking about the issue of really Roe v. Wade, which again was a decision by the Supreme Court that happened in 1973, and then it was turned again this past summer in 2022. Before I get any further, I'm not usually this cautious with other issues, but again, I know this one's a very controversial one. It's one I tend to avoid in most of my classes, but this one we have to address it. And again, I have when it comes to maybe government policy, I clearly will lean one way, but if I'm really honest, privately, I do think it's a complex issue myself. And I don't judge anybody for how they might feel about this particular issue. So I'm going to do my best to make sure it's, not tip my hat either way. So hopefully I'll succeed at that. So what I want to start with, though, instead of talking about Roe v. Wade at first, talk about another case that's not as well known, although it did come up some this summer. There were a couple of podcasts that actually talked about this, but this is a case, big surprise because it's me, that took place in Florida. But this was really the first case that became a national case about abortion. So the woman you see here is Shirley Wheeler. She was a young woman, I believe 22 at the time, who was from North Carolina originally. She came from a pretty rough family. She had an abusive father. At 16, she was raped by two men. She did become pregnant from it. She gave the child up for adoption. I think her brother I think took it, but I'm not positive about that. She eventually moved to Florida, Daytona, Florida, because of various health issues, including what happened to her. Doctors did not recommend birth control for her. And in fact, she was under the impression that she probably could not have a child again. She ends up getting into a relationship with a person, good Lord, Robert Wheeler. In fact, she ended up taking his last name. They didn't marry. They were more of a common law marriage, but that's why we know her as Shirley Wheeler. They lived together. She worked at a wig shop in Daytona. He was a photographer. He was also a very dedicated surfer. They had a very nice relationship. And, she was living a nice life, and then became pregnant. And right after this, he had a vasectomy because, he was under the impression she couldn't get pregnant. And because of this, she decided to have an abortion, which was illegal in Florida at this point. And the way this worked was she knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody. And so there was a doctor 90 miles away in Jacksonville for $3,000 would perform the abortion. And she did. She agreed to it. She was, blindfolded, willingly blindfolded, but she got into a car. A woman drove her to the doctor's office, blindfolded, so she wouldn't know exactly where this office was. And this is, again, very typical. Did not know the name of the doctor. He began to do the procedure, and not to get too graphic, but essentially using a catheter, putting a catheter in her and then pushing on the uterus to induce a miscarriage. There were complications. She began to bleed. He basically said, "You need to go to the hospital. But I'm not taking you. You go to the hospital." He leaves. She goes to the hospital. The miscarriage does happen. It turned out to be a female fetus. As the doctors and nurses taking care of her, but the authorities are alerted. And there's always been debated, like, who did that? Was it an orderly? Because this is supposed to be a private matter. Maybe, who knows? But she was reported to authorities and arrested. So let me stop the story there, and I'll pick it up in a moment. By the way, this is a photo of her taken by Robert Wheeler. All the photos we have of her, since he was a photographer, we get from her standing in front of the apartment that they lived in. Okay, so before we get back to Miss Wheeler, talk a little bit about abortion law in America. So there really wasn't any laws about abortion, and really in England, which is where we get a lot of our laws from, or in the colonies, or even the early United States. We don't really see abortion laws until after the Civil War. And there's a lot of debate over this, depending on which side of this issue you are. Some people say, well, of course there's no abortion laws because no one's having abortions back then. It was so bad, no one would do it. Well, that's not true. Other people said, well, of course, there's lots of abortions. I think I heard one person say it was as easy as 1, 2, 3, which also isn't true. But it was something that was done. You know, it was a practice done. For instance, Benjamin Franklin, in a publication from 1848, did indeed have a section where he talks about how to have an abortion. You know, things you could do to end a pregnancy. So to really look at like why was perhaps there no explicit laws about abortion? Well, there's a couple of reasons for this. First off, I mean, just to be straight up, it wasn't something that a lot of people probably thought about, especially men. Women's health, menstrual cycles, nursing, childbirth, reproduction, these kinds of issues really weren't something that most men were aware of or wanted to be aware of. You know, this was the domain of mothers and midwives and nurses and female healers. So there was kind of almost a separate domain of women's health that was kind of outside of, if you will, the male dominated world. And so ending a pregnancy would have been something that would have been done by some women, but wouldn't have necessarily been, you know, the founding fathers, other than Ben Franklin, may not even have been aware of much of this, if you will. So this was very much kind of private to the woman's sphere, if you will. Another aspect of this is, and this is why I have this weird drawing here, is we do forget that even as recently as 150 years ago, the 19th century, in other words, how little we really understood what happened inside of a human body, you know, in an era before ultrasounds, before x-rays. The idea that, you know, of what's really happening, it's just, it wasn't known. I mean, the 19th century, I talk about a lot of this a lot on my Scotland program because we were in Edinburgh, and Edinburgh was the center of medical practices in the 19th century. One of the big things Edinburgh as a city was known for was having lots of schools, dissection schools and dissection examinations. The frontier in the 19th century, I mean, in the 20th century, the frontier might be atomic energy and space. Today, it might be genetics and AI. In the 19th century, it was inside the body, trying to figure out what's going on in here. I mean, going back to the Roman era, in classical era, they knew about hearts and, you know, organs, but still really what's actually happening. And in particular, what's happening during reproduction. I mean, it's not wrong to say that, you know, an 8-year-old today may know more about how reproduction works than perhaps Galileo at one time did, or Newton did. And it's not because, you know, they weren't smart. I mean, they're geniuses, but it's just, there was no way of actually knowing what's really happening with fetal development. How is an egg, you know, fertilized by the sperm? Those, you know, again, this is a medieval work, you know, this showing that we're little tiny humans, fully formed little tiny humans, a homunculus that's actually just going to grow in the, you know, we know that's not quite how it works. So to be honest, it wasn't something people thought much about because they didn't really understand what was really happening at this point. There was sort of, if you will, kind of common practices about this issue. So essentially, until a time that's known as the quickening, this is when a mother would feel the baby kicking, moving in their belly. That's really the first time that a woman knows for sure that she's pregnant. Again, pre-ultrasound, pre-pregnancy test. After that point, it was assumed that you would not do something to end the pregnancy. I mean, there was kind of a line drawn at that point. So, of course, the classical way that you could be pregnant is you miss a menstrual cycle. Of course, there's other reasons why that could happen. But that was usually a couple of menstrual cycles go by. You think, oh, I must be pregnant, and you might do something, take a pill, take a potion, do something. And they used to sell these in newspapers and magazines. I mean, they openly sold these things. Again, relieve suppressed menstruation. The term often was restore the menses. That was kind of the code word for ending a pregnancy. Because once your menses comes back, that means you're no longer pregnant. So relieve your suppressed menstruation. I mean, normally that's not something you want to induce unless you're pregnant. So there were pills and medicines that people would take to do this. And again, it wasn't something I think a lot of people necessarily were aware of, but this was something that was there. We do see a little bit of men talking about this in the 1840s, 1850s. There is a touch of this. In New York, there was a woman who was known for performing abortions, and some people spoke out against this. But generally speaking, it was not part of the national dialogue in any way or fashion until after the Civil War. Then we start to see laws being passed in both Georgia and Florida, for instance, including the law that Shirley Wheeler is going to be convicted under. Were passed. I think that one was 1867 down in Florida. There are a couple of reasons for this. One, it's a little bit more medical knowledge. But part of this comes from a gynecologist named Horatio Storer, who, again, was a professional gynecologist. And he talked a lot about abortion. So, in fact, this is one of the books he published in 1868, Criminal Abortion, looking at the social, medical, and legal aspects of abortion. So one of the things, to go back to Dr. Storer for a second, so one of the things that's happening is we're seeing a professionalization of the medical field, including women's health. The idea of being medically trained, of being licensed to be able to practice medicine. And again, this is mostly a male-driven field. So male gynecologists see midwives, healers, abortionists as quacks, as competition, as something that needs to be rooted out. So there's that aspect of this. The Storer also takes another approach. And in many ways, this is the approach that really had the biggest effect. Post-Civil War, you have two things happening. You had freed African Americans. Now, literally millions of African Americans, men and women, who now can vote, they're citizens, having children. There is white fear over this. I mean, that's why later we get things like segregation. We also are beginning to see lots more of immigrants coming in, especially as we get into the 1880s and 1890s, but we're already beginning to see it soon after the Civil War. Many of these immigrants are from Southern Europe, from Eastern Europe. Many of them are Jewish, but also many of them are Catholic. Keep in mind, the United States was overwhelmingly a Western European Protestant nation. And today we talk about Judeo-Christian values. That's not a term that was used much until the 1970s. Before the 20th century in particular, and even up until the 70s, there was a real divide between people who were Jewish and people who were Christian, and then within Christianity, between people who are Protestant versus people who are Catholic. Lots of prejudice against Catholicism in America. And of course, the Catholic Church has always had a very strong aversion to birth control and even specifically abortion, and even going back to I think it's the 1300s, where the Catholic Church is issuing orders against ending pregnancies. So he is like, okay, we're going to have a lot of people, African Americans and immigrants coming over, who are going to have lots of children, but the people who are having abortions tend to be middle-class white Protestant women. I say middle class because they could actually afford to pay somebody to do this or buy the medicine. And so according to him, the very people we want to have the most children are having less children. And the people, according to him, that we don't want having children are. So in other words, he sees abortion not only as a health threat, and I do need to be fair here. A lot of these abortion cures, or these, restoring the Menzie cures, were not safe at all. So there is a real argument there. But he also sees them not just as competition, but also as a threat to white Protestant America. Basically a 19th version of the replacement theory. That had a big effect. And he began to lobby legislatures to pass laws, and this kind of caught on. So between the 1860s and really about 1900, almost every state is going to have some kind of anti-abortion law. However, they're not going to be enforced very often until after World War II. But they all share some traits. They're all very similar, not, some variation. They all have aspects that they have to be a licensed doctor, has to approve it. I know in Florida, you had to have at least 2 doctors approve the abortion before it could happen. Pretty much it had to be, the mother had to be at risk. There were some other exceptions that the baby was going to be deformed or have, some major problems. Sometimes interracial relationships would be an argument. But again, there was a line drawn at the whole idea of the quickening, that there was a timeline here. After this, you could, even with approval, you couldn't have an abortion. And we do see a little bit of this in newspapers. There's not a lot, but what's interesting, it tends to be the doctors or nurses who are arrested. This is from the Atlanta Constitution, 1878. In St. Louis, Missouri, 2 doctors are arrested for abortion. 1886, also from the Atlanta newspaper. This is actually somebody in Georgia, a Dr. Gardner. Dr. Gardner was arrested for being involved in an abortion. This is 1916, also in Georgia. Here in this case, it is an African-American nurse who was arrested for performing an abortion on a young white woman. So again, we do see some conversations about abortion, but for the most part, not much until after World War II, an era of the baby booms, also changing sexual ideas. We're seeing the beginning of the sexual revolution. We're seeing the pill come in. People are talking about these kinds of issues, and abortion becomes something that people are talking about. And they're talking about it on both sides. Some people are concerned that maybe abortions are rising in, actually, I shouldn't say maybe, they were rising in numbers. But also going back to Storr, the concern over health. This is just, one of those statistics. Legal abortions made up 1/6 of all pregnancy and childbirth related deaths in 1965. Not only is a lot of women doing this, but it is very, very dangerous many times what they're doing. So back to Wheeler. So Shirley Wheeler was arrested for having an abortion because, again, somebody at the hospital told the authorities arrested her. They even showed her a picture of what was supposed to be her fetus. And that's how she learned that it was a female. And so not only was she arrested, but she was convicted of the crime under this 1867 Florida abortion law. And she was the only woman in the nation to actually not only be arrested, but convicted under any kind of anti-abortion law. And because of that, it began to make national news. Newspapers across the country reported on this case. Even the Village Voice in New York was reporting on this case. And this kind of became sort of a touchstone. Already, many women were arguing for wider birth control and for more access to abortion. Some states were beginning to allow it, like New York. Other states still were not. Florida, for instance, definitely was not at this point. So she became a bit of a rallying cry. Several women's marches. People would talk about freeing Wheeler. We need to work on this case. Now, by the way, what happened to Wheeler? She did not go to jail. She did not have a record. There was a sense that this was, something new, something different. So she got probation. She was ordered to either marry Robert Wheeler. A lot of people don't realize that there was a law until 2016 that men and women weren't supposed to live together if they weren't married. I think Georgia still has that law in the books, by the way. It's of course not enforced. Or she had to leave, and she took leave. She decided not to get married. She went back to North Carolina. They did appeal the case and eventually made its way to the Florida Supreme Court. And the Florida Supreme Court did indeed overturn the conviction. But the Wheeler case, more than anything else, began to get this conversation going. Like, we need to talk about abortion. We need to decide what is going on with abortion. Are we going to legalize it? Are we going to make it, you know? And what's interesting is that in the early 70s, there were definitely some people who were uncomfortable with abortion, but by and large, you know, the majority of Americans were kind of pro-abortion. Again, a lot of people weren't really thinking a lot about it. It was actually seen as kind of a specifically Catholic issue. You know, Catholics may have a problem with it, but the rest of us aren't that don't seem to have a problem with it. Even some Protestant churches kind of seem to, you know, tacitly not be completely against it, which might be quite shocking today, considering, you know, there is such a divide on this today. And we're starting to see states, you know, like Maryland in 1970, for instance, starting to say, well, maybe we're going to start allowing abortions, while other states were doubling down on not allowing them. So this is, again, starting to become a dividing issue. The Atlanta Constitution had an editorial arguing for better legalization of abortion. And again, the argument was, you know, if we don't have legal abortions, we're going to see more women dying, because it's going to have, they're going to have abortions. They're just going to do it in back alleys. And so again, even in places like Georgia, there is a lot of newspapers arguing for legalizing abortion. And as we know, this past summer, a case that was argued last October, the Dobbs case overturned Roe v. Wade. And so I think, you know, we're going to be hearing lots of debates over abortion yet again. And it'll be interesting to see where this case goes. Because Roe v. Wade pretty much, you know, ended any debate over political, legal debates over abortion for 50 years. So we'll see, as the Dobbs case, is this going to be the law of the land for the next 50 years, or is this something that's going to be short-lived? It'll be interesting. But let's talk about the Roe v. Wade case. And I just, as I'm talking, I realize there is a typo. That is not Norman, it is Norma. So there shouldn't be no N at the end of the name. So Norma McCorvey was Jane Doe. So as in, excuse me. Oh my gosh. Jane Roe. Two typos in the same slide. My goodness. If it was an hour and a half into this, I'd stop and redo this. So Norma McCorvey, Jane Roe, that was her pseudonym because this was a very private issue. She did not want people knowing her name at the time. She was from Texas. She was pregnant. She did not want the child. She wanted to have an abortion. She could not follow the law and have the abortion. She could not get permission to do it and get the doctor's approval. Lawyer Sarah Weddington and another lawyer, Linda Coffey, took on her case. They realized this is a good test case for getting these state laws perhaps declared unconstitutional. So obviously she's going to end up having a child, because by the time the case is going to work its way through the court system, it's going to be longer than 9 months, of course. There is a second case that happens in Georgia. Sandra Cano, but her pseudonym was Mary Doe. In this case, is going to be the Doe versus Bolton case. Both the name in this case is going to be the name of the General Attorney of Texas. And both these cases are going to be running through the court systems at the same time and decided pretty much at the same time by the Supreme Court. Let's talk about the Roe v. Wade case. That's the one that everyone knows about. That's really the case. The decision of Roe v. Wade was actually written by Hugo Blackmun. So the actual decision was written by him. It was announced in January of 1973. There's actually a couple of books written on January 1973, because in January 1973, LBJ died. Also, the peace treaty for the Vietnam War was signed that month, and Roe v. Wade came down. So again, this was a pretty significant month, and both these Roe v. Wade and LBJ's death happened literally the same day. And that's why the New York Times has LBJ at the top, but over just below it, you do see Roe v. Wade decision being led there. So what was this decided upon? It was basically partly the Ninth Amendment and the 14th Amendment, as in the earlier birth control cases. So to a large degree, this kind of rested on a series of questions. So does government have a say in abortion? And the answer that Supreme Court said is yes, safety of mother, protect life of a baby. When are either at stake? Abortion, we can have abortion in the first or second trimester, dividing up the 9 months into trimesters, right? The argument is in the first and second trimester, essentially, the fetus is not viable. It can't live on its own. Therefore, the mother's life takes precedent. But after that period, then the fetus's life takes precedent because now it could possibly live on its own. So when is it viable? Third trimester. So the idea is we are going to allow abortion in the first part, but we're not going to allow it in the second part. And again, it says government has no say until third trimester. Because before that, the argument is it is the woman, this is her body. Yes, there is a growing fetus there, but it's still part of her body at that point. It's not completely an individual because it can't live on its own. So at that point, the government doesn't have a say. This is a privacy issue. This is, a issue between a woman and her medical care. But after that point, now the argument is now you're talking about two people and the government does have a say at that point. So that's really what Roe v. Wade kind of handles on. So again, they're using 9th and 14th Amendments to make these arguments. It's when you talk about things like abortion and the Constitution, it gets tricky because this is not really where the Constitution was planning to go. And so with some of these types of issues, it is very hard to get into these and how do you quite argue this? And it's always been a little bit shaky legally. And people, whether they support it or were against Roe v. Wade, always knew that this was vulnerable if it was ever challenged, which we saw this year. So again, the 14th Amendment, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the U.S., nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws. And again, this is about the person's life. This is about their happiness. It's about their liberty until the third trimester. I mean, that's where it's being argued on. Doe v. Bolton, again, arguing that abortion from a Georgia law, is a professional judgment that the Georgia physician will be called upon to make routinely. We agree with the district court that the medical judgment may be exercised in the light of all factors, physical, emotional, psychological, familial, and woman's age, relevant to the well-being of the patient. All these factors may relate to health. In other words, if it's not just is the mother's life at stake, in other words, if she has this birth, will she die? They're saying, well, her emotional wellness can be a factor in this. Her financial arrangements. Maybe she doesn't want to have another child. That a woman is that's all part of a person's well-being. And therefore, again, up till the third trimester, a woman has the freedom to make that decision. That when we're talking about health, we're not just talking about, is my heart going to stop beating? It can be all of these factors. So again, with these two together, it pretty much overturns any state law that bans abortion, at least up till the third trimester. Norma McCorvey does eventually, well, actually, let me back up, sorry. So these cases are announced, and Roe v. Wade is the one that most people focus on. It was controversial, but it's interesting that it wasn't as controversial as you might think initially, because again, a lot of Americans thought, well, this is a good decision, even if they didn't, like my own mother's example is, I may not agree with abortion, but does believe it should be an individual choice, not a government choice. And it was seen as kind of a Catholic issue to be against it. And again, many churches came out and agreed with it. But throughout the 70s and into the 80s, that begins to change. And later we will talk about some of these changes, some of the cultural, political changes where this issue starts to become a hot button issue. So Norma McCorvey did not want people to know who she was, but eventually later in the 70s into the 80s, she does announce, yes, I am a Roe. I'm Jane Roe. And this is her a pro-abortion, pro-choice march. She's an interesting person, though, because, again, she's just a regular person, was not necessarily ready for the limelight and the pressure and to be literally the face of abortion. And as we'll talk about towards the end, she's a complicated person. And this is her with Holly Hunter, the actress. They did make a movie about this for HBO back in the late 80s. And so she was on the set and advising the film. And again, what a lot of people argue, for Roe v. Wade is that it did make it safer. It is one of the safest procedures out there, at least, now I know some of you are already saying, well, for the mother it is. And yes, that's what we're talking about, for the mother. Okay. We're going to come back to abortion briefly a little bit later. So let's talk about the other big issue for women in the 70s, the other big hot button issue that's not such a hot button issue today, but like abortion is, but it was huge at the time. That was the ERA amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment. And in fact, it's a very simple amendment. This is supposed to be an amendment to the Constitution. It's small enough that it could actually fit on a button. The equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Period. It seems very simple. Why not just pass it? It was proposed in 1923, and it kind of just sat there for years and years. But in the 1970s, partly because of Mary Tyler Moore's show, bringing a lot of these issues to the forefront, but obviously things like Title VII, Title IX, all these laws we've talked about, a lot of people said, it's time. It is time. So almost 50 years later, Congress passes the ERA. Again, this is an amendment to the Constitution, but it does need 3/4 of states to approve it. Making an amendment to the Constitution is not something you can do very lightly. The argument was this is going to happen. I mean, people are like, this is a no-brainer. This is basically pretty much Title VII, just in Title IX, just putting those ideas in the Constitution. What's the big deal? And, people like Betty Ford on the Republican side, people such as Lady Bird Johnson on the Democratic side, both first ladies, are both firmly behind this. This is seen as the capstone of the women's movement. This is it. This is the pinnacle where we've been fighting for all these things, and this is going to be the last barrier to bust through. And again, people thought this is going to happen. Old, young, Democrat, Republican, this is going to get through. Most people were for it. Maybe not all the men, but most people were for it. And again, there was a deadline, 30th of June, 1982. 38 states were needed. Some states did this very, very quickly. Not surprisingly, the South tends to be a little more conservative, a little slower to react to a lot of these issues, much more traditional in gender roles. The Southeast was slow to approve this, and a little bit in the West also. So this is where we were, but most people thought this, because a lot of these states did it immediately. Others wanted to debate about it. So, but the assumption was this is going to happen. Okay, just on to me. This is a weird turn. So hold off on the ERA. Let's get back to TV for a moment. With issues like abortion and gay rights and equal pay, being talked about so much on TV, a lot of people were a little uncomfortable with TV, maybe talking about these adult issues. Then a TV movie came on, a movie called Born Innocent, starring Linda Blair, famous for the film The Exorcist. This is a TV movie. I mean, it looked like this is like drive-in exploitation. Like, this is a television movie that dealt with a young girl who was sent to a reform school and at one point was brutally raped. I mean, I'm not even going to show you the clip. I mean, it's a shocking scene for a TV movie. And this came on at 7:00. And it is an exploitation film. You can catch it on YouTube. She's a woman. She's in women's prison. She's 14 years old. She's learning fast what you have to learn to survive there. it's a shocking film. And the fact that it came on 7 p.m. shocked a lot of people. And it seemed to be, for some people, a sign of where we were heading. You know, we're talking about abortion now. We're talking about all these things on TV. It's not safe for children anymore. So there was a big push that perhaps we need to have a family hour on TV, that there's a set time that shows will come on and they will be family friendly. Then after 9, then you can have the more adult shows when the kids are in bed. So in 1975, it actually was established by the FCC, the Federal Communications Council, that we are going to install this idea of the family hour. The problem is that does smack to some people of censorship. It's supposed to be free market. It's supposed to be freedom of expression. You know, if people don't like these shows, they do not watch these shows. Advertisers don't have to advertise in these shows. It should be government hands off. But yet people say, well, these are public airwaves. So this for a brief moment was a very controversial issue. So for instance, shows like All in the Family actually did a special show arguing against the family hour. Now, it was ruled as unconstitutional. It was seen as a violation of the First Amendment, but most networks actually maintained this all the way up until really till the 90s. They would unofficially maintain this because they kind of realized it was good for business. It made people a little happier. And but also freed them up, like movie ratings. It freed them up to have even stronger content as long as it was after 9 o'clock. So they kind of saw that it was a little bit of a give and take issue. What's interesting is that the family hour is sort of like a dividing line for American television. So after the family hour debate, we do begin to see TV start to shift. And we kind of see this in politics as well, partly late 60s, early 70s, which really, 67 to about 74, it's really kind of the 60s. And this is when a lot of these issues that we've been talking about really kind of came down, and debates over things like abortion and equal pay and segregation, sex discrimination, and all these kinds of things, at the Vietnam War. And, once you get about the mid 70s, Americans were getting a little burnout on some of this. You're like, okay, we've dealt with these issues. So in politics, we see a shifting away from some of these issues. There are some Americans that are also kind of uncomfortable with some of these issues, and we'll see this in politics, a shift to the right from the left. But on television, we see sort of a shift to kind of lighter shows. And in particular, one network, ABC, starts to kind of sort of drill down into these kind of TV shows. A show like Charlie's Angels is a good example of this. I'm going to play the opening to Charlie's Angels.
Once upon a time, there were 3 little girls who went to the police academy. And they were each assigned very hazardous duties. But I took them away from all that, and now they work for me. My name is Charlie.
I'll go ahead and stop there just for time because I know we're running long already. So again, this is one of those shows, Charlie's Angels, a infamous show from the 70s, a huge hit that, it's trying to do 2 things at once. It's pretty women running around without bras on. It has to be Charlie's Angels. It's supposed to be sarcastic, but 3 little girls. So it's, on one hand, you have these strong women that are fighting the bad guys. They're independent women, but they're also very mixed sex objects. They're kind of appealing kind of to traditional males in the audience as well. And this is kind of a symbol of this kind of new type of television. This is not Maude. This is not Alice. This is kind of a throwback to glamour Hollywood, but mixed in with the sexual revolution, and in a weird way mixed in with the women's movement. The breakout star, of course, and I guess I can say breakout in more than one way, was indeed Farrah Fawcett. And again, this is not an accident. It's not like I picked this photo up. It's almost every photo you would find her from the show is, clearly there's a lot on display here. We start to see other shows in the late 70s like this. And again, most of them tended to be ABC shows, which became CBS was the number one network in the early 70s. ABC will become the number one network in the late 70s. Shows like Three's Company. And if you're not familiar with it, this is a little bit of the opening.
Come and knock on our door.
Come and knock on our door.
We've been waiting for you.
Been waiting for you.
Where the kisses are hers and his, Three's Company too. Come and dance on our floor.
Come and dance on our floor.
Take a step that is new.
Take a step that is new.
We've a lovable space that needs your face, Three's Company too. You'll see that life is a ball again, laughter is calling for you.
I mean, even just from the opening song, it's bouncier, it's a brighter show. It doesn't feel like those other shows where it's all about the city and kind of, serious issues. This is a show where John Ritter plays a character who is going to live with two friends, that are, two women friends. But of course, the apartment they live in, they don't allow men and women to live together who are not married. So he pretends to be gay. So every episode is the people they're renting from trying to figure out whether Jack is gay or not. Are they having sex in there or not? And then Jack, the male character, is also always kind of hoping to have sex with these two women. And so it's a very sexy show, lots of double entendres, very silly, a lot of ogling of the women on the show. And even feminist symbols like Wonder Woman. And I actually love the show. A lot of young women love the show, but yet there definitely was another aspect of the show other than female empowerment. She was somebody that a lot of men like to look at. You had shows like Love Boat. Again, light shows about romance and sex. Favorite people go in the Love Boat and they fall in love. Here's a little opening of Love Boat.
Exciting and new. Come aboard. We're expecting you and love. Life's sweetest reward. Let it flow. It floats back to you.
Again, very light, very, very silly kind of show. Again, lots of women in bikinis, lots of sex, lots of double entendres. And even other shows, even shows that may not be all about sex, had a lot of sex in them. And in the 70s, late 70s, blondes with well-endowed chests were definitely the most popular type of character. What this becomes known as is jiggle TV. A reference to the women on the shows. And the shows didn't hide it, that's exactly what they were selling, women bodies on display. One of the ironies is there were more women on television at this point, even as lead characters, than there even had been in the early 70s during the time of Mary Tyler Moore. And again, Mary Tyler Moore show ends in 77, just kind of as, if you will, the lighter jiggle TV sort of era emerges. It's like one goes right into the other. But we are seeing lots of shows with women, but again, looks become very important. Wearing sexy outfits becomes very important. So again, it is the end of the beige TV era to a large degree, kind of like the rural purge had been in the early 70s. And even getting away from always directly sex, we do just see kind of an era of happier shows like Happy Days, kind of silly shows. Shows that are often taking place in the more innocent times
Monday, happy days.
of the 50s.
Tuesday, Wednesday, happy days. Thursday, Friday, happy days. The weekend comes, my cycle hums, ready to race to you. These days are happy days. These days are share them with me. Goodbye, crazy.
gray sky, hello blue. There's nothing can hold me when I hold you.
Again, light, bright, fun, taking place in a time before abortion was an issue, before what, all the issues of the 70s. This is taking place before. Partly it's 20 years later. There was a lot of nostalgia for the 50s. The baby boomers were now adults. So some of that's just, that happens. But, this was a #1 show in the late 70s. And again, why was this #1? Well, because Americans were kind of ready to move away from super serious issues for a while there. And this was a good representation of that. And again, TV got very silly again. It got very light. For those of you who are fans of Robin Williams, who I was a big fan of growing up, I mean, this was what, a show called Mork and Mindy, which came out of Happy Days, was a big hit in the late 70s and early 80s. So we can kind of see the culture wars play out on TV. So again, we see sort of a decline of these kind of socially focused shows to kind of silly, fun shows. And even though the Family Hour was really technically only around for a little over a year, but that issue kind of led to a toning down of language. I mean, we'll watch more of All in the Family later. And, there's some strong language on that show and these kind of very controversial topics. But yet, ironically, we do see a lot more sex on TV, even though these are kind of more socially conservative shows on one hand. On the other side, though, they tend to be more violent, but in a cartoon way, but also more sexually overt shows, but kind of in a more traditional, less challenging way. And to some degree, there is kind of a shift to the right on these shows that we can see emerging in politics, something we'll talk a little bit about later in this course. So what about the ERA? We kind of put that on pause for a moment. Well, in the same way there was a shift on television, there was a shift in politics, and we can see this with the ERA. So in 1977, there was a National Women's Conference in Houston, Texas. This is really the kind of the moment where there was a real change. This is the moment. So Gerald Ford created a National Women's Commission. This was funded by Congress, and this women's conference to deal with women's issues was kind of the climax of this. And the thought was that maybe by this point, the ERA will be passed, and maybe they'll even announce it at this conference. Didn't quite turn out that way, but it did get 20,000 people showing up. And again, even this image, you can see Rosalind Carter, the current First Lady at that point. To our right, you can see Betty Ford sitting there. So again, this was people of different parties coming together to talk about women's issues. There was a sense of unity here. But then coming from stage right was a woman named Phyllis Schlafly, who purposely held at the same time, same place, a counter rally. And she got 15,000 people to show up. And yet there was no federal funding for this. But these are people that felt maybe some of the women's movement is not where we need to be going, in particular, abortion and the ERA. Now, she was one of the first people to really speak out loudly against abortion, but she was also Catholic. I mean, in a way that wasn't quite surprising, but she began to attract audiences of people who weren't necessarily Catholic themselves. She was Republican. She was a mother, married, and really had spent a lot of her time writing about foreign policy. I mean, she was a successful writer. She was a political advisor. I mean, in many ways, kind of represented the modern woman. She was somewhat independent. She was very strong, very forceful, but was arguing on these things, again, from the political right. In fact, the conservative movement, capital C conservative movement, which starts in the 60s, she's one of the major leaders of it. In fact, I don't think she's quite gotten enough credit for that, the success of that movement. Regardless of whether you agree with her or not, she's very divisive, but nonetheless, it was very powerful. Very anti-gay rights, anti-abortion, anti-birth control pill, anti-ERA. And again, there was already by the late 70s some growing concern over the health concern over the pill. So that wasn't unique to Phyllis Schlafly. There was starting to be some push away from the pill a little bit. This is a little bit of Schlafly. She was very self-aware and kind of was the original troll before the internet was here. So here's a quick clip of her talking about some of her tactics.
I would sometimes frequently start my speeches by saying, I want to thank my husband for letting me come here and talk to you tonight. Oh, the feminists just got so upset at that. Now, isn't that silly?
And again, like as she always opened with that. And, you know, she wanted the outrage because it got a press, it got attention, it helped her cause. So again, she was, again, quite self-aware of what she was doing. And here's another one of her talking.
I do think the feminist movement is an extremely destructive movement. I think it has poisoned the attitudes of so many young women, teaching young women to plan their life career without any space for marriage, husband, and children. Now, you know, people can plan their life any way they want, but there are plenty of women, and you're seeing their tearful complaints all the time now, who get to be 35 and 40 years old, and they realize life is passing them by.
So in many ways, what Phyllis Schlafly kind of revealed is that there was, as I talked about at the very beginning, there was a divide between women. And she shone a light on it and actually began to open up that divide. I mean, really, you know, kind of ended that unity, that at least the appearance of unity. But in particular, ERA became her main focus. And first, she would argue, like, we have equal rights, you know, the Civil Rights Act, the Title VII, Title IX, you know, there are protections there. They just got to be enforced. But in particular, the biggest argument she made, and I will say, I've talked about this in class before. When I bring this up, a lot of students get funny about this. She said, you know, at this point, the draft ended in 1973. The Selective Service ended in 76, but it came back in 1980. So some people thought the draft wasn't even an issue, but she said, if we're ever going to draft again, if we have the Equal Rights Amendment, women have to be drafted. And I've said this in class before, you know, just, you know, predicting that I don't think we'll ever see a draft again, because even without the ERA, it would be hard to argue, you know. And it's funny because a lot of people get really funny about that. Even in 2022, like, oh, you know, I mean, that was a powerful argument. She's also concerned that, you know, maybe women with children, if they get divorced, husbands may just say, well, I don't have to support you, you know, because we're equal, you know. So some of these traditional arrangements she thought that actually helped women would go away. And she just thought this was just way too radical. And again, we're in 2022, we're still having these debates about gender and language and such, and where are the lines, you know. And so she was arguing we're going to have, you know, multi-gender bathrooms. We're going to, you know, we're not going to have any division between men and women. And again, like I said, some of these arguments sound kind of relevant to some of the arguments we're having today. Here is a clip of her on a show called Firing Line. This is a PBS show hosted by William F. Buckley, who was a major conservative voice at the time. I'm going to play it for two reasons. It's about 3 minutes, so I'm going to play most of it. One reason is you can see kind of the difference between, you know, Phyllis Schlafly on one side and the feminist activists on the other. Now, of course, Firing Line kind of purposely picked people but you can kind of see kind of even just the way they look, how different they, you know, these two sides were emerging. But I also want to play it because you can kind of hear a slightly different style political discourse compared to the very loud, almost pro wrestling element that we hear on CNN and MSNBC and Fox today.
This is a repeat of the Firing Line program originally telecast on April 15th, 1973.
The other day, the state of Connecticut ratified the so-called Equal Rights Amendment, bringing at that point the total to 28 states out of the 38 required to graft the amendment onto the Constitution. The national chairman of the movement to stop ERA is Mrs. Phyllis Schlafly, who is here today and raring to go. Dr. Ann Scott is vice president for legislation for the National Organization of Women. The proposed constitutional amendment, passed overwhelmingly by the Senate and the House, holds that, quote, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. That doesn't sound particularly subversive, and I would therefore like to begin by asking Mrs. Schlafly to state her principal objection to ERA.
Well, it's the very innocuous wording of the amendment that is the reason why many people didn't realize in the beginning what unfortunate consequences it would have. But fortunately, the amending process calls for a full-blown debate in the state legislatures around the country, and this is where we find out some of the things that were not originally realized by many people who voted for it. We find, as we look into the matter, that ERA won't give women anything which they haven't already got or have a way of getting. But on the other hand, it will take away from women some of the most important rights and benefits and exemptions we now have.
What would be an example of that?
Well, a great glaring example on which there's full agreement between both the proponents and the opponents is the matter of the draft. Women are exempt from the draft. Selective service says only young men of age 18 have to register. But the Equal Rights Amendment will positively make women subject to the draft and on an equal basis with men. Nor could you have a system whereby the women would get all the nice, easy desk jobs and the men get all the fighting jobs. It would have to be equal across the board, in combat, on warships, and all up and down the line.
Do you agree with that, Dr. Scott?
There is no question that if the Equal Rights Amendment is passed, that women would become subject to the draft. However, I think that we have a situation now where the draft is going by the boards. And furthermore, I think the question is not one of the rights of women here, but it is the question of the draft. Clearly, no sane parent would want to see either child, either a son or a daughter, subject to the draft. But if women are to be citizens and citizens are to be subject to the draft, then women should take the responsibilities as well as the rights of citizenship. But it's not simply a question of being subject to the draft, it is also a question of denial of opportunity.
And again, that's, I mean, she's admitting women would have to be drafted, and politically and socially, that's a tough argument. And Schlafly did, it took a while, but she did actually kind of point this out, and a lot of people were indeed uncomfortable with this, and essentially she kind of ended it. So 1977, Indiana, 35th state, they needed 3 more. It was the 35th state to pass it, and it would be the last state to pass it. In fact, Florida would actually be kind of the death knell. Florida did reject it during the same year, and no other state would take it up. Actually, a former ABAC student is currently working on a long-term study of what happened in Florida at this point. And because again, a lot of this has not been researched very much, like what's really going on here. So really, more than anybody else, Schlafly really kind of ended this. And this is more than it really, even more than abortion, because again, abortion was only just starting to become a dividing issue. This really was kind of the beginning of the split between the women's movement between right and left. And it would continue that way until the 80s and 90s. And it's also, again, the beginning of the rise of the right. There was kind of a centrist majority in America between the Democrats and Republicans, where you weren't getting radical left or radical right, but in the late 70s, you're starting to see the rise of a stronger right wing of the Republican Party come to power. And Schlafly was really kind of one of the leaders of that. Without Schlafly, there may not have been a Ronald Reagan or George H.W. Bush. I mean, American politics would look very different without Schlafly. However, by the 1990s, she was seen as too right. This is a photo of her in the early 90s with Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan gave a very famous speech, infamous speech in the Republican convention in 1992, which basically railed against immigrants coming over and the changing of Western values, and was seen as just way too right-wing, and Schlafly was very much seen as a part of that. But in 2016, she kind of emerged again, because by that point, politics had kind of swung back that way. And she became a big supporter of Donald Trump, somebody who argued about building a wall to stop immigrants, but also was, by that point, very openly pro-life and said, I will choose only Supreme Court justices that will end Roe v. Wade, which actually the 3 justices he appointed did indeed end Roe v. Wade in 2022. But Schlafly was a bit of a kingmaker here. Donald Trump went out of his way to court her, to get her support. And she died in 2016 before the election. And kind of unlike Trump, who doesn't like to usually be associated with things that are very sad and stuff, he made a point of going to her funeral and speaking at her funeral because he knew he needed that Schlafly wing. Abortion, of course, has remained a huge issue. In fact, it's become a bigger and bigger issue every decade since Roe v. Wade. Again, this is one of those issues that's divided Americans, including women, including even the women involved in Roe v. Wade. Now, Norma McCorvey is an interesting person because, again, she's a real person, and like real people, conflicting attitudes, and you change throughout your life. But she's also a bit of an unreliable narrator. So she was very pro-choice in her actions and her speeches until 1994. And then she began to speak out against abortion and go to a lot of pro-life movements and act. And again, people do change as they get older. You know, that's normal. But she passed away in 2017. By the time before she passed away, she then said, well, in 1994, I was paid by the pro-life movement to support him. That was just an act. And you know, but during her pro-life activity, she said, well, I was sort of talked into Roe v. Wade. I didn't really want to do it. I didn't really know what I was doing. That doesn't seem to necessarily be an accurate recollection. So she's an interesting person, and depending on which side of this issue you fall, it depends on how you think of Norma McCorvey. Of course, the decision is beyond any one person. You know, now the other person, Ms. Kano, is a little more complicated. She did renounce it early on. Her case does seem to be a little more complicated. It does seem to be she may not have been quite aware of the implications of her case, and she never wavered on the fact that she was always pro-life. So even Norma McCorvey herself is controversial, you know, in how we think of her. Schlafly died in 2016, as I mentioned. I was fascinated by how the internet addressed her. You were seeing a lot of images like this, you know, implying the witch is dead. Now, obviously, depending on what your politics are, you know, how you might feel about Schlafly, but at the same time, it is interesting, and we do sometimes see this in politics, that the gendered, you know, to call her a witch is in itself sexist in itself. And oddly enough, Mary Tyler Moore also died in 2017. So three of the biggest women of the 70s who had huge impacts, Mary Tyler Moore, Phyllis Schlafly, and Norma McCorvey, all died within 6 months of each other. And that is the very long lecture about women's rights in the 70s. So thank you for sticking with it the whole time, and I will see you guys in class. Thanks, guys. If this will stop. It doesn't want to end. Okay.